So it's over. Presents are unwrapped. The wrapping paper might even be put away. The washing up's done. The turkey's probably not finished.
Washing up not so much.
I was just thinking, don't worry. It's a pure coincidence. The celebrations have finished. All the work of December, the preparation, it's complete. Apparently, even the weather thinks it's done. That like yesterday, sunshine and warmth is a thing of the past, and winter is here. And the thought I had when I was reading this morning's talk, because I was on emergency standby from yesterday, so I think one had been feeling it might not feel too good today. So the thought I had was, well, what next, really? The build-up's done, the celebration's done, Christmas is done, what's next? And then I met Peter in the hallway as I came in, and he gave me a clue, because Boxing Day is also St. Stephen's Day, and there are two things about St. Stephen that made me think that this is what's next. One of which from Peter was, apparently St. Stephen is the patron saint of people who drink too much. So as I'm sure there were plenty of supplications to him on Boxing Day morning from people who had indeed drunk too much on Christmas Day. But the second thing that, perhaps more seriously, the second thing was that Stephen was also the first martyr of the church. So as I'm sure you know, he was stoned to death. And I never really thought before of the juxtaposition that Christmas Day is the celebration, Jesus is born, Jesus is here now. Then the very first Saints' Day afterwards is the first martyr, somebody who was stoned to death for his faith. And that got me thinking about, well, what about resolutions as well? Because for me at least, there's a period of calm now between now and New Year. And the next thing seems to be, okay, now Jesus has come, we're here, well, what about New Year's resolutions? What about the future? What is next? And there were three things, one of which relates to Stephen and a couple of which relates to the book that I've been reading, which Marie did tell me last time. I forgot to say who it was by or what it was called, just in case you didn't read it.
I'm reading a book.
It's a reading a book, any book. So it's called Gifts of Imperfection. Probably seems suitable. It's by Brené Brown. So the two things that I've got in my head that I would like to work on, one of which is stillness, which she defines as being just creating a space where you can push away the emotions of the day, push away all the things that crowd in all the time, and just spend some time in a bit of a zone where you're not being interrupted constantly. And I think if you throw in prayer and some study and some thinking about God into that, it sounds quite prayer-like to me. So one of which is to try and craft some time for stillness. And as a trailer for what I think my next talk might be, I've also started to wonder whether, even when it feels like when you're trying to pray and you're not hearing anything, that actually needs to be a bit more of a sense of perspective on that. Well, actually you are hearing something, especially what are you hearing, and what does it really mean? That's the next slide, because I haven't thought it through enough yet. So one resolution is some stillness. The second one is calm. And I think Mary and Joseph were surprisingly calm today, because I can tell you, if I'd lost Daniel and Ella, who were about the age that Jesus was, and I'd been travelling back from somewhere and thinking that they were just in caravan with the rest of the gang, and then realised after a day of travelling that they weren't there, and then had to travel all the way back to Jerusalem, and then spent 3 days finding them, I don't think I would have just said, what are you doing? I think I would not have been that calm. And even though she said, well, you were a bit anxious, this is the way it kind of comes across, I think I might have felt a bit panic struck from that. And again, what Brené Brown is saying about calmness, which I think is right and definitely for me, is that in the moment of an interaction, to try and keep a sense of perspective about it, to not get sucked into the whole thing and make it about my reaction to how I feel in the circumstances, more about what's really going on here, how do you take a step back, how do you remain calm. And she makes a good point, which is calm and anxiety are both infectious. And I was going to make a cultural reference. Do any of you know the TV show Dad's Army? Was it on in Canada? Maybe not. I'll risk it, you can go and YouTube it afterwards. So it was set in England, and it is very English, and it's about some people who were in the Home Guard in the Second World War, and one of them always runs and says, don't panic, and of course the more he runs around and says, don't panic, the more people are panicking, and it's like, Brendan Brown also used it, will you calm down, as though kind of being agitated and shouting at someone to calm down is likely to set that example of calm. And so I think creating an example of being calm is also something I would like to work on. And then the third thing, which I think is not from Brendan Brown, this is from Bonhoeffer, but I think it also really comes into St. Stephen's Day, is today seemed, I didn't want to say back to reality, because I think Christmas and joy is also part of reality. Nevertheless, it's snowing, it's frozen rain, it's ice pellets, there are still the pounds that you pulled over Christmas. Nothing actually necessarily has changed in the last week. And Bonhoeffer reminds us this thing called cheap grace. He says there's no such thing as cheap grace. So he says there's no forgiveness without repentance, there's no communion without confession, and there's no grace without discipleship, and there's no grace without the cross, and no grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. And I think St. Stephen and Bonhoeffer are both reminding us that yes, in this path of discipleship there is joy, and there are some really, really good things, but there is also a discipline and a price to be paid, and some hard work to be put in, and that's probably not a bad thing to think of. Not a bad thing to think of as New Year's resolution time comes along. And then there were two more things on New Year's resolutions, one of which was I also resolved to be realistic with my New Year's resolutions this year. So occasionally I'm envious of my friends who run marathons. Gosh, that's very impressive for you, 126 miles. I can tell you I try running every now and again, about twice a year actually. And I can tell you that usually I overdo it, and usually that means I cannot run again for the next week and a half because I'm so utterly stiff running as a board. And it is no good to look at somebody who can run a marathon and think, oh, I'm going to go and do their training regime, that's going to be my New Year's resolution. One has to decide that there might be a goal of running a marathon, which there isn't, by the way, really. But there might be a goal of running a marathon, but the resolutions more have to be what's my step-by-step approach to get to that goal? Because just going out and deciding I'm going to do a 10-mile training run, I can tell you is a recipe for disaster. And I think in many New Year's resolutions, there are too many 10-mile training runs and not enough. Well, I should start by going for a 15-minute walk every day or a piece of mile exercise first. And I believe that's the same in spiritual life as it is in the life of running and fitness. And finally, although I need to get the book, I don't remember everything. Finally, St. Paul also had some guidance for resolutions today. So he says that we should clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And they don't seem to be bad resolutions either. So on this Sunday, which is quiet and still, and a bit of an island in a busy time, but a good time, I think it's good to think of humility. So what are our real gifts in this vast universe that there is, and what we resolve to do is now Christmas is done. That's what I'm this morning. So, what do we sing?